Hello. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome. It's good to see you all here and to hear your enthusiasm. My name is Nancy Kalick. I'm Interim Director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America this semester while Trisha Rose is on sabbatical, and I'm incredibly pleased to see so many of you here for tonight's lecture by Professor Vicki Ruiz, Distinguished Professor of History and Chicano-Latino Studies and Chair of the Department of Chicano-Latino Studies at the University of California, Irvine. Dr. Ruiz will be formally introduced by my colleague, Monica Martinez, who is Assistant Professor of American Studies and Ethnic Studies here at Brown. But I wanted to extend a warm welcome to you all and to Dr. Ruiz on behalf of the CSREA and remind you of some upcoming events in both the How Structural Racism Works series, for which we have events scheduled later this month, as well as other workshops, lectures, and upcoming conferences that are hosted by the center and its affiliated faculty, details for all of which can be found on the CSREA website. We are very pleased and excited about this evening's program, which will be followed by a reception just outside, to which you are all welcome. And without further ado, to introduce our distinguished guest, Monica Martinez.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm thrilled. This feels like a party for me because I'm so excited to have Vicki Ruiz on campus. I'm also not embarrassed to say that on accident in my enthusiasm to introduce her, I wrote a 3-page single-spaced introduction, which she quickly vetoed. So just know that my enthusiasm is extensive. Vicki Ruiz is Distinguished Professor of History and Chicano-Latino Studies and Chair of the Department of Chicano-Latino Studies at the University of California at Irvine. Over the course of 3 decades, Ruiz pioneered the field of Chicano-Latina history and has published over 60 essays and over 12 books. An award-winning scholar, she is the author of Cannery Women and Cannery Lives and From Out of the Shadows, Mexican Women in the 20th Century America. Her edited or co-edited anthologies include Unequal Sisters, An Inclusive Reader in the U.S. Women's History. She and Virginia Sanchez Corral co-edited 3 volumes of Latinas in the United States, a historical encyclopedia, which received a 2007 Best in Reference award from the New York Public Library. And in 2015, Vicki Ruiz received a National Humanities Medal from President Barack Obama. And this morning, the Ethnic Studies Senior Seminar all agreed, we think that our nation would be better if President Barack Obama took classes with Vicki Ruiz. I'm also going to go off script and read some from my 3-page ode to Vicki Ruiz. And talk a little bit about her stellar research and publishing career, which has helped to not only inspire generations of Chicana feminists and historians, but has also been recognized by her colleagues as the person to lead the agenda for professional academic organizations. Vicki Ruiz has been elected president of the American Historical Association, the Organization of American Historians, the Pacific Coast Branch of American Historical Association, the American Studies Association, and the Berkshire Conference for Women's History. Being elected president of 5 professional academic organizations reflects the esteem in which her leadership is held, and I can't underscore the importance of having a scholar like Vicki Ruiz represent the professional organizations as their president. In her CV, you can read as prolific as she has been in her publishing and research. She has been committed to community organizing. Every university that she's been to, she's been committed to building bridges beyond the Ivy League, beyond the academy. And as a president of these professional organizations, she's been committed to changing the culture within those professional organizations, to reorient the urgency behind the kinds of research that needed to be done, and to considering multiple publics in shaping research projects. This is the last little paragraph. As president of these professional organizations, Ruiz helped shift the culture of academic institutions. In her presidential address to the American Studies Association, Ruiz exclaimed, quote, "American studies, ethnic studies, and gender studies are campus settings for a renewed emphasis on the multi-ethnic civil collaborations. Our obligations as agents of change do not end at the campus parking lot. She continued, more important than our personal efforts, we seek to leverage the resources of the university for social justice. I mean, come on, that's a little bit of what inspired me to go to graduate school and become a professor. So Vicki, thank you so much for coming, and we can't wait to hear your talk, Class Acts, Latina Feminist Traditions, 1900 to 1930.
Well, thank you for that absolutely lovely introduction. I wanted to, let's see, put this out of the way. First of all, I would like to thank Christina, Caitlin, and Professor Martinez for their warm welcome, and thank you. And thank all the students. I hope you're getting, really lots of extra credit for coming. I want to talk to you today about a woman two women, one in particular who inspired me and whom I knew as a graduate student, Luisa Moreno. So I'm going to sort of compare their two feminist traditions. Women are capable of everything and anything, declared labor radical Luisa Capetillo in her landmark feminist treatise, Mi opinión sobre las libertades, derechos y deberes de la mujer, my opinion on the liberties, rights, and duties of women. Published in 1911, this manifesto articulated a radical vision that promoted a variant of Republican motherhood alongside free love and proletarian revolution. Now, she was a passionate labor leader in Puerto Rico at the turn of the 20th century, who would later extend her reach into the United States and the Caribbean. Less bold in her pronouncements, Guatemalan feminist Rosa Rodriguez Lopez in 1925 stressed the importance of education across class. The woman continues to be attached to ignorance. Her emancipation is necessary. Feminism will make her conscious, and by obtaining an adequate education, she'll be prepared for a much more ambitious future. Mirroring her generation, Rodriguez Lopez stressed the importance of, quote, the proletarian woman continues to live miserably in darkness with no other light than the vague reflection of love. A striking statement from a young woman who 20 years later would be an influential leader in the California labor movement. Known by that time as Luisa Moreno, she changed her name after she moved to when she began her organizing in Florida. She was the first Latina vice president of a major CIO union and applied her considerable skills to spearheading the 1939 El Congreso de Pueblo de Habla Española, the Spanish-speaking People's Congress, which was the first national U.S. pan-Latino civil rights Congress. Now, when we talk about Latina feminism, okay, what do you technically get? Okay, usually it focuses on Mexican women, first off, and second of all, it usually begins in the 17th century with the poet Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, and then let's just fast forward to the Chicana feminists of the 60s and 70s, with maybe a nod to Jovita Gonzalez, the 30s. Now, remembered in Latino history for their organizing prowess, Capetillo Moreno were also path-breaking feminist intellectuals whose writings expand our understanding of transnational feminist ideas emanating from Latin America, literally and figuratively. They acted as bridges across the Americas, representing rich historical connections between Latin American and US Latinas. Now, there's been a fluorescence. It's not like Latino history is a new thing. Latino historiography it's 40 years old, okay? And yet still, Latino narratives remain at the periphery of US history. Capetillo Moreno are no exception. Now, in fact, it's not until 2004 that Mi opinión is available in English. And beyond a single dissertation and one journal article, the writings of Luisa Moreno have languished in the Biblioteca Nacional in Guatemala, where they are housed. Though these two iconic figures in Latino labor history never met, Capetillo died when Moreno was 15, their legacies intersect in multiple ways, especially in terms of their unwavering commitment to a radical labor politics predicated on the dignity and self-determination of the working class. Starkly divergent, but at times hauntingly similar, their feminist writings reveal threads of a Latina transnational consciousness that reaches across nationalities and generations. Now, this is just, I'll talk about this. I'll talk about this article at my research seminar in the morning. I just realized I was being taped, so I won't go off script. But maybe a little bit, I will in Q&A. Now, on October 28, 1879, Luisa Margarita Perrone and Luisa Capetillo Echeverria, a common law couple, welcomed their only child, the aptly named Luisa. Both parents were relatively newcomers to Puerto Rico. Margarita had arrived from France, Luis from northern Spain. Their European heritage and education, however, provided no guarantees of social mobility, as Luis did odd jobs and Margarita took in laundry. Though she grew up in modest circumstances, Luisa was surrounded at an early age by great books. Margarita, in fact, had elbowed her way into a local tertulia, or literary salon, setting a path for her daughter to follow. As an adolescent, Luisa became romantically involved with the son of a very powerful political patriarch. She became involved with Manuel Ledesma, and they had two children together. But 2 years after the birth of their last child in 1901, the relationship ended when Ledesma bowed to familial pressure, which included a suitable marriage. Now, while he provided support for their children, she went out to work. She placed them in the care of her mother, and she got a job as a reader in a cigar factory. She would use this position throughout her career and in several locales within and beyond the island in order to cultivate and reinforce workers' consciousness on issues of trade unionism, socialism, anarchism, and women's rights. Now, in the midst of the economic upheaval that followed the Spanish, Filipino, Cuban, American War, I use all four. I think the textbook, Created Equal, I think that's the textbook, I was a co-author. I think we're the only US history textbook that uses the correct name. I think it's correct because, look, was the war fought in the United States? Was it fought in Spain? No, it's Cuba and the Philippines. So I have to put everybody in there. It's what happened in the aftermath of the war. It was a militant trade union organization, one with strong anarchist leanings. Its standard bearer was the Free Federation of Workers, the Federación Libre de Trabajadores, whose principal organizers included Luisa Capetillo. For over a decade, she traversed the island, mobilizing workers in agriculture and cigar factories, as well as writing essays on proletarian and feminist issues. Now, her homilies were unconventional, but in 1908, the Federación had adopted women's suffrage as part of its platform. 3 years later, she published Mi Opinión, a collection of her itinerant essays, and ironically, the book coincided with the birth of her third child, Luis, by a married lover. Now, she was driven out of Puerto Rico by a government crackdown on anarchists, and she departed from New York City in 1912. She would spend the rest of her days as a truly transnational labor radical and feminist intellectual. She moved a number of times, organizing workers in Florida, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic. In Tampa, Florida in 1913, she was welcomed into the multi-ethnic cigar community of Ybor City, which was heavily Latino. But she stood out not only for her feminist and anarchist beliefs, but also for her appearance. Whether she did it out of expediency to blend in with male workers, or she did it out of comfort, safety, or deliberate political statement, like the Lady Zooters of the 1940s, she dressed in men's clothing, complete with vest and necktie. In Cuba, she was arrested for, quote, causing a public disturbance by wearing manly attire. But a judge acquitted her of all charges. Charismatic and passionate, she proved to be a fearless labor organizer, helping tens of thousands of workers secure significant wage increases, including during Puerto Rico's Great Sugarcane Strike of 1916. Before her final return to the island, she went to New York City, where she ran a boarding house and adjoining restaurant, dishing up revolution and vegetarian fare. At some point during her many journeys, she contracted tuberculosis, to which she succumbed in 1922 at the age of 42. Now, she was a radical intellectual who challenged the ramifications of empire in the day-to-day. Now, some US historians say, oh, she's the Puerto Rican Emma Goldman. Well, she's much more than a Puerto Rican Emma Goldman, though the parallels seem obvious. More importantly, she embodied a decolonial imaginary as a transnational feminist, unmoored from nation, race, or gender convention. I'm sorry, you're getting feedback. Yes, yeah, one or the other. Blanca Rosa Rodriguez Lopez, by contrast, had a much more conventional path to women's emancipation. Like other middle class and elite Latin American feminists, she anchored her hopes on education as the key to securing equal rights for women. Now, she was born August 30th, 1907, And she had the most unlikely childhood for a future trade union leader. She grew up in a family of wealth and privilege. She was the daughter of in her native Guatemala, the daughter of a powerful coffee grower, Ernesto Rodriguez Robles, and his socialite wife, Alicia Lopez Serrana. Now, she was educated by nuns in a California boarding school, and then when she returned home, by private tutors. She desired a university education in Guatemala, but discovered that women need not apply. She organized her elite peers into La Sociedad Gabriela Mistral, named after the famous Chilean education reformer and poet, to push for greater opportunities for women. Despite some success, by the age of 20, she left for Mexico City. Now, she pushed for now, at the age of 20, she leaves. For 2 years, there's this, it's considered the sort of incipient feminist movement in Guatemala. It's certainly the most important feminist organization until the 1940s revolution. But she leaves. At age 20, she goes to Mexico City in order to go to UNAM, and she also worked as a journalist for Guatemalan Daily. And she really sort of participated in the burgeoning cultural renaissance. I have a picture of her with Diego Rivera. She consorted with the likes of Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, Dr. Attal, who was her mentor. And she published in 1927 a poetry collection at the age of 20. And she also married Miguel Angel de Leon, who was a Guatemalan artist about 16 years her senior. He too had escaped his elite family in Guatemala. He in fact had joined the French Foreign Legion during World War I. But in 1928, they decide they're going to do something. They're going to do something completely different. They're going to go and make their lives in New York City. This is not a good time to come to New York if you are a Guatemalan poet and an artist, okay? Although they're fluent in English, French, and Spanish, when the Depression hits, times are hard. And with the birth of their daughter arrived in 1929, and their fortunes had declined to the extent that they were living in East Harlem, and she had secured work as a seamstress. In my interviews with her, she talks about how she had never sewn a seam in her life. But after getting kicked out of about 5 garment shops, by the 6th, she got the hang of it well enough that they hired her. The death of a work friend's infant from rat bites compelled her to do something to change the material conditions of her fellow workers. She organized a small garment workers union that was associated with the Needle Workers Industrial Union, and then when they were taken over by the ALGWU. By 1930, she was involved in a number of leftist community groups and was a member of the Communist Party. In 1935, she made 3 decisions. She left a tattered marriage. She left the Communist Party, and the reason why she left the Communist Party is she accepted a job with the American Federation of Labor. American Federation of Labor had sort of a problem. They were organizing African American and Latino cigar rollers in Florida. And a friend of labor, Joseph Shoemaker, had been basically tarred and feathered and then lynched by the Klan. This occurred like 3 weeks before her arrival. As she said, they thought it was young, green, and expendable. Now, it was there in Florida where she assumes her new identity. She takes her name Blanca Rosa, and she becomes Luisa. And she chooses the alias Moreno, which I think is a really direct opposite to Blanca Rosa, or dark. And I think she took the name Luisa as an homage to Luisa Capetillo, whose work she undoubtedly knew about and who had organized there 2 decades before her. In Florida, she honed her skills, negotiated a contract covering 13,000 workers. She and the FFL had a huge falling out because the FFL national office renegotiated the contract to be more favorable to management, so she encouraged workers to reject it. So they banished her to Pennsylvania, where she worked shortly with cigar rollers, and then in 1938 joined the United Cannery Agriculture Packing Allied Workers of America, or UCAPAWA-CIO. What's also she was involved with, and I can talk about this later, but she was involved in the pecan sheller strike in San Antonio. She was the official representative sent to bring these incredible workers, great street demonstrations, get 10,000 people in the street, 1,000 people arrested, but they're not forming a union. They're not forming a negotiating committee. They're not forming a boycott committee. They're not forming sort of food donation committee, fundraising. And so she's called in there to sort of make these incredible street demonstrations a union. And it caused a lot of tensions. And in some places, she's been absolutely written out of the story. Now, during World War II, she mobilized cannery workers in Southern California. And of course, as you know, if you've read Cannery Women, Cannery Lives, which they had unprecedented improvements in their working conditions, wages, and benefits. And she became the first Latina to serve on a state CIO council. I'm happy to say that La Plaza de las Culturas y Artes is having in Olvera Street, is having a wonderful history exhibit called LA Begins Here. And they have a whole section on the cannery workers. So I cannot tell you, it's just thrilling to have been involved in that project. The American Federation, what happened was the American Federation of Labor, were in control of the Northern California canneries. They decided at the end of World War II they didn't want to be in the cannery union business. And so they gave their contracts without worker consent to the Teamsters. The workers approached Okapawa, which was now FTA, and said, can you come organize us? Luisa Moreno did the largest organizing campaign of her career. Within a matter of weeks, 72 plants were covered under NLRB elections. They were union certified. But in 1946, with growing concerns, red baiting, and certainly concerns about the, quote, communist influence in FTA, the NLRB was pressured to rescind the results and called for a new election. There was a great deal of intimidation, sweetheart contracts, and at one point, women workers were beaten up by Teamster goons in front of the Libby's plant in Sacramento. Miraculously, they lost by only 2,000 votes. In 1947, she retired from private life, married a fellow radical she had met in New York in the 30s, and 1948 began to fight her deportation from the United States, but to no avail, and in 1950 she was deported, and what she referred to as the death of Luisa Moreno. Now, although both women made their mark within the U.S. labor movement, they came to their meaning of feminism within a Latin American context. However, they were not part of the Pan-American networks that fostered exchanges between U.S. feminist leaders and their Latin American counterparts. Estelle Friedman, Ellen Du Bois, Catherine Marino have all talked about this, but they're not part of that. They're very separate. Their capacious education and intellectual appetites seem to have fed their transnational feminist imaginary, for they drew upon European, US, and Latin American examples in essays outlining their paths to equality. Now, while Capetillo, she combined the grinding work of labor organizing with writing her feminist essays, there's a distinct separation between Rosa Rodriguez Lopez, the sheltered adolescent intellectual, and Luisa Moreno, the fearless labor leader. Though writing feminist essays ended with their adolescence, Moreno always cultivated women's grassroots leadership and made sure their issues were at the forefront of collective bargaining. Now, for a fuller understanding of the transformation of Blanca Rosa Rodriguez Lopez de Leon into Luisa Moreno, we have to look into her early life. The 1920s was the first period of any sort of reform in Guatemala, and a group of young urban elites took advantage of this opening to advocate for women's rights and educational uplift. La Sociedad Gabriela Mistral was formed in November 1925. Rosa was its president. She was 18 years old. And indeed, it's been called the most recognizable women's group of its era in Guatemala. Laden with noblesse oblige, the pronouncements of these adolescent feminists cut both ways, taking aim at women of their own class, as well as the plight of the downtrodden. In essays published in Guatemala's national newspaper, El Imparcial, and literary journal Vida, they decried the intellectual property prevalent among their peers. Now that's power. I think that's their father's power. Can you imagine? Oh, my daughters, Graciela and Rosa, they're writing these feminist essays. You're going to publish them in your newspaper, aren't you? Okay. These articles featured female role models of womanly achievement who reflected their own expansive education, from the Greek philosopher Hypatia to French novelist George Sand Uruguayan physician Paulina Luisi to the famed Polish scientist Marie Curie. However, they also railed against the impact of Hollywood and popular fiction on their generation's cultural taste. What sort of future awaits Guatemalan youth, especially the women? For today, they're nothing but puppets who care only about their friends, their boyfriends, the movie stars, fashions, and dancing. Gee, sounds like the Kardashians, doesn't it? Wrote Graciela Rodriguez Lopez. Indeed, Graciela would go so far as to characterize such cheap amusements as, quote, Westerners' opium. Now, the members of La Sociedad Gabriela Mistral also targeted the mother's generation, these, quote, useless women caught up in society soirees and petty intrigue. Quote, women gossip with our mouths, with our thoughts, with our eyelashes, with our hands, and even with our feet. Rosa Rodriguez Lopez leveled even harsher criticism in the pages of El Imparcial for all to read. These are mothers by name only, for they have no conscience of their maternal condition. How many of them abandon their children as stupid servants for the life of frivolity or laziness? For the Rodriguez Lopez sisters, these observations struck home. In her interviews later in life, Rosa remembered her father as a real person, but her mother as a peacock who never emerged from her boudoir until 11 o'clock in the morning. To promote the educated woman, the members of La Sociedad opened a small library filled with classic literary texts that would instruct and inspire. Quote, La Sociedad Gabriela Mistral aims to educate the women, to train them so they can take part in the great game of life. Why should there exist an educational difference between women and men? In order to present themselves for, quote, the world and their household, women should have knowledge of proper grammar, literature, foreign languages, as well as development and hygiene, which is an umbrella term which also included sex education. On a more abstract level, education would purify women and make them companions, not objects of men. As young adult women, they understood the impact of their transgressive writings and responded to criticism that their activities might decrease their value on the marriage market. In the words of Josefina Saravia, I firmly believe that a man will never obtain relative happiness unless he is next to a well-educated woman of very strong moral convictions. And with confidence, she predicted that every special woman, morally and intellectually, will find her corresponding kind of man. Reminds me of the 1970s button, men of quality respect women's equality. Cloaking their efforts in a rebozo of enlightened motherhood, these young feminists emphasized the value of education, from literature to child development, to creating citizens from the homeland. So it's wrapped up in feminism, maternalism, modernity. It's fusing maternalism and feminism. And they welcomed and valorized their place and obligations as well-educated women. Perhaps with a twist of irony, these daughters of Latino coffee planters, men who ushered in a caffeinated modernism, would themselves gravitate toward a tangible imaginary of a benevolent modern state where properly educated women as citizen mothers would exercise considerable moral authority for their children's welfare and national progress. This is not a new idea, but it's an idea that's very prevalent across Latin America. Now, what role would proletarian women play in this bourgeois feminist ideal? Here's where the Sociedad made, some of the members made their boldest statements. In addressing the deplorable conditions of the poor, they're not using eugenic arguments, they're not using environmental arguments. They are blaming the state. It is the government's obligation, the same moral and material obligation that a father has with regard to his sons, to deal with the progress and culture of its people. Moreover, workers should be paid a living wage. These were strong claims coming from a very privileged group. Now, of course, they also wanted to do their part, and they opened a small secretarial school. For them, that they like both classic works and clerical work. Those were going to be sort of the guidepost for more uplift and social equality and national progress. Now, calling for, quote, the destruction of all social prejudice, of all absurd fanaticism, Rosa Rodriguez Lopez understood that the fates of rich and poor women were inextricably related. Blaming ignorance for women's slavery, she launched biting critiques of the double standard and predatory men that she calls ravenous wolves. In her essay, The Problem of the Fallen Woman, she notes how the glitter of jewelry or the wonders of love could seduce women. In calling for compassion, she also viewed employment as, quote, the temple of work, a way of advancement. And a rare display of essentialism, she dismissed that so-called practical feminism of the North American woman, which would be inappropriate to our romantic race. Yet she did not believe that Guatemalan women did not yet possess the education required for suffrage. Yet in the same breath, She argued for the complete abolition of women's inferiority, asserting that women were as worthy and capable as men and deserved justice and political and social equality. The tension between the ideal woman and the women they knew really resonates throughout the writings of these young women. As self-anointed leaders, these young women drew upon their rare, capacious education to exhort, to uplift, and to dream. Now, it was an organization that was in existence for about 2 years, and when the charismatic president left, the organization began to falter. Through petitions and informal lobbying, members had played a role in opening up, albeit ever so slightly, educational opportunities for women. And it brought issues of women's rights, economic disparities, and racial injustices to the pages of the national newspaper. More importantly, members of La Sociedad, including Rosa's sister, Graciela, would emerge later. So Rosa would leave, always then, from then on, marking her unchaperoned, oh my God, going to Mexico City. From then on, she would be the prodigal daughter in her family, and particularly later on with her labor organizing. And then, after the 1944 revolution, many of the members of La Sociedad Gabriela Mistral show up again, this time as middle-aged women, and they fight and achieve women's suffrage. In fact, women gained the right to vote in Guatemala in 1946. In a 1949 interview, Graciela reflected on the decline of La Sociedad, explaining that the initial burst of enthusiasm, many of its young members lost interest, and, quote, the society simply faded away. Now, there's several layers of meaning one could read in that statement. First, as adolescents, they grew impatient for results. They wanted revolution to happen, and they wanted it right now. They also, I would argue, did not anticipate the level of criticism they would get from elite men who they thought that would be their allies. They were the men of the La Generación de 20. I mean, these were, men who encouraged them. And then men started writing, saying, well, wait a minute, we didn't encourage this. Indeed, these feminists also, in fact, they went out of the way, these women. Rosa, in fact, said, well, no, we're not smug women of letters or mannish suffragettes. They went out of their way to assure readers of their femininity. They also buckled under familiar or political pressures, given their pronouncements on poverty and government culpability. And Catholic priests, no doubt, looked askance at these young women whose not so thinly veiled anti-clerical observations cropped up in their published essays. And also, the membership didn't really recruit beyond a small group of elites. They were friends, they were a social network, and they really they were a very closed group. Now, why, as I said, why did she leave Guatemala? Well, I think she understood the life that was awaiting for her, the traditional gendered expectations and the freight of her family's wealth. For example, when one of her siblings married, the fountain on the family's compound was filled with champagne, Veuve Clicquot to be exact, not the cheap stuff. So I think she understood that it was an act of rebellion. It was an act also to pursue her own life as a poet and intellectual. Moreover, she traveled she traveled over the course of her life. She was always on the move. But she always kept with her the reviews of her poetry collection. Like any author, you keep the good reviews. And she treasured them. And in fact, in one of the reviews, they refer to her book, they call her, quote, a bright light in Latin American literature. And even compare her to Gabriela Mistral. That's, I think, it's a bit of an overstatement. And in a newspaper article on her 21st birthday referred to her beauty, poetry, and vanguard feminism. Now, why? Why did she choose to make the decisions that she did? Look at it. Yeah, why, when the Depression hit, why didn't she go back to Guatemala? When she left her husband, why didn't she go back to Guatemala? But I would argue that she sort of conjugated her own identity, that she changed, I call conjugating identity a self-reflexive and purposeful invention or inflection of one's sense of self, taking into constructions of race, class, and ethnic identification in order to facilitate her work as a labor organizer and civil rights advocate. She was light-skinned. Emma Tenayuca referred to her in an interview with Zaragoza Vargas as that damn Spaniard. With her light skin, education, and flawless English, she could have passed as a white woman of ambiguous heritage. Instead, she took a very risky job as a trade union organizer, working with African American and Latinos at the anti-union Jim Crow South. Rosa Rodriguez Lopez was a woman was a girl of privilege. Luisa Moreno was a woman of people. Now, Moreno's work as a labor leader certainly echoed the legacy of Luisa Capetillo, but Capetillo's anarcho-feminism, rooted in the politics of the body, could not be liberated. It can be replicated. For Capetillo, women's autonomous control, it wasn't education, it was control over their own bodies, was essential for liberation. In mi opinion, she argued that women get married only to follow the custom, and men do so to have a helper or slave. Quoting a French feminist, Madeleine Vernet, she wrote, "The slave can never love the master." In her utopian view, men and women would come together as virgins, establish committed relationships without sanction of church or state. And perhaps her parents' example influenced her thinking, which was also in line with her anarchism. In a letter, Nancy Hewitt says, well, maybe because she was disappointed because her relationship with Manuel Ledesma didn't work out. Indeed, in a letter written to Ledesma a decade later, she reveals her, quote, yearning for him. And when she said, "You destroyed my illusions and cruelly mortified me, beset by desire to have the one who made life bloom in me, sprouting into two souls, product of my spontaneous love without fetters." Speaking from her own situation, she believed that women were responsible for their own happiness. Now, mi opinion, if you read it, it's like a 19th century prescriptive literature. It's like a Spanish version, in a sense, of Ladies' Goatee Book, in that she offered scenarios are presented and then advice is offered. Gendered parables, so to speak. If a woman has a neglectful spouse, for example, and in her solitude she seeks comfort in the arms of another man, she should not be blamed or punished for following her natural impulses. And that's pretty radical, 1911. Though Capetillo did not always practice what she preached, she warned about women getting involved with a man who was in a committed relationship without demanding that the man give up his wife or lover. With a dash of melodrama, she continued, if this wife does not want to leave him, she'll have to admit that her husband has another woman, because she cannot force him to love her if she has not the charm or persuasiveness to keep him herself. Well, that's not very charitable, and it's not very feminist, is it? It also seems a bit self-serving, giving her own relationship with a married lover. Demonstrating a level of pragmatism, she endorsed reforms familiar to feminists across the hemisphere, including women's suffrage, protective legislation, and temperance. She broke with other anarchists, such as Emma Goldman, in support of suffrage. She did not believe that women would vote with their gender. She thought they would vote along their class. And I think that's due to her experience as a labor organizer. Like feminists of her day, she put faith in enlightened, educated motherhood as the foundation for social progress. Now, this is an ambitious agenda. She said, in addition to hygiene, women should have a thorough knowledge of physiology, geology, geography, chemistry, physics, astronomy, engineering, agriculture, geometry, history, music, and painting. And she also emphasized that someone could be learned but not educated. Don't we know that well in the academy? In her words, a proper education returns to cultivating patience and a sweet disposition. And she even offered beauty advice. Women must strive by all natural methods to become more beautiful, but it must be a true beauty, achieved by healthy diet without eating meat or drinking alcoholic beverages. Like the young women of La Sociedad Gabriela Mistral, Capetillo rebuked women who indulged in conspicuous consumption, describing one apocryphal figure as so loaded with bracelets and lace as to look like a bazaar. Now, I think, however, close readings of selected passages of Mi Opinion should not overshadow Capetillo's commitment to proletarian revolution based on anarchist principles. As a grassroots activist, she encouraged working-class men to accept women into their ranks as full partners in their struggles. Both Luisa Capetillo and later Luisa Moreno believed in the dignity of the working poor, who by their labor enriched the wealthy. In her only surviving speech, Caravans of Sorrow in 1946, Moreno spoke passionately about the rights of Mexican immigrant workers. Long before the grapes of wrath had ripened in California's vineyards, a people lived on highways, under trees and tents, or in shacks or in railroad sections, picking crops, cotton, fruit, vegetables, cultivating sugar beets, building railroads and dams, making a barren land fertile for new crops and greater riches. These people are not aliens. They've contributed their endurance, sacrifices, youth, and labor to the Southwest. Shades of Luisa Capetillo. Don't beg, you destitute workers, you victims of exploitation, exploited by political parties, by religions, by commerce. You are the eternal mine from which the bourgeoisie and the religions extract enormous treasures. Fiercely anti-clerical, Luisa Capetillo imagined a world where churches would become schools and libraries, and the worthy images in them would be consigned to museums. She also believed that feminism would play a vital role in the revolution. And she set the stage, not just the shop floor or at home, but within the individual. The woman who feels wounded in her rights and liberties in womanhood has to recompose and reclaim herself, change her situation, no matter how high the cost. Scholars have disagreed on to her legacy. Eileen Suarez Finley said, she was a real pain in the ass to working class men, to working class women, to middle class feminists, that she really didn't cultivate because she was very plain spoken, and said that calling women slaves for being married and staying in unhappy marriages an economic necessity did not further her cause. And she also said Capetillo faced a daring uphill battle because the fears of proletarian women who believed that without marriage, men would feel fewer obligations to their children. What I would add is two further points of skepticism. One is most working women wanted a measure of respectability, to be viewed as gente decente, and raising children alone retained such standing. Also, the power of religion influencing Latino worldviews cannot be underplayed, given the vital role that the Catholic Church played in their lives. But I would also agree with Felix Matos Rodriguez, Nancy Hewitt, and Yvette Rivera Giusti that she had exceptional gifts as a labor leader, and that in fact inspired a generation of Latino organizers in Puerto Rico. According to Hewitt, Capetillo proved the linchpin in a vast network of Latina anarchist and socialist feminists who sought to advance the interests of workers and women internationally. And Matos Rodriguez places her legacy on a philosophical level. Mi opinion shows that Capetillo, as an author, was convinced of the power of humanistic thought, in her case based on anarchism and feminism as an effective tool to change the world. In fact, a year before her death, her essay appeared those among familiar advocates like Emma Goldman and Rosa Luxemburg in a feminist collection published in Argentina. Now, certainly, these women reveal certainly a thirst for women's equality, well-educated. Las dos Luisas placed their faith in enlightened womanhood for either national progress or proletarian revolution. And it's interesting, they valorized motherhood, even though they themselves were not particularly great parents. By the time she published Mi Opinión, Capetillo had lived apart from her older children for 10 years, while Rosa Rodriguez Lopez and her peers waxed poetically and presumptuously about maternal duties purely in the abstract, given their own positionality as sheltered adolescents. As an organizer always on the move, Moreno was an absentee parent for most of her daughter's life. From the time her daughter was around 7 till she was 13, Bitil was shuttled from one foster family to another. Now, but exile, whether forced or self-imposed, figured prominently in the two women's life scripts. I would argue that Moreno fostered women's rank-and-file leadership, incorporated their issues at the bargaining table, and she practiced a labor citizen model, a feminism grounded in their experiences rather than hers. Perhaps she understood as the youthful Rosa Rodriguez Lopez, she had borne much of the responsibility for the demise of La Gabriela Mistral. Now, I want to talk about their self-presentations. They had very different self-presentations. So let me get back in here. Well, I'll talk about this. This is from a pamphlet from her defense committee, trying to raise money to keep her in this country. Notice how they're portraying her as a classy dame. The woman who was my enemy talked about her as a real lady or a classy dame. She could not ever quite escape her class background. And in this representation, they have her wearing a dress and the heels, like right? She has immaculately coiffed hair, and she's wearing heels. Okay, so this is sort of a very representation of her. And then you see Capetillo. And that is basically an Argentinian artist, sort of a colorization of an actual photo. The actual photo is very faded and grainy, but this I think really sort of speaks to the way in which she passed in her labor organizing. Certainly in direct contrast to the ideas that she's in a dress and heels. would argue, in fact, that Luisa Moreno, anything was but an elegant radical. Now, I think that certainly that both women are powerful examples of a decolonial feminist imaginary. Perhaps Sophie Daviala maybe less so, Capetillo certainly fits in there, but certainly Moreno was seen as threatening to the state. The Immigration and Naturalization Service and the FBI started tracking her actions as a labor lawyer in the late 30s, beginning with the contract today. So certainly she was considered threatening to the state. But they worked outside of established Pan-American, Latin American feminist networks. They were nevertheless, I think, influenced by these international circuits, explained especially by the feminist writings, indeed, emanating and filtered through the Americas. They framed their advocacy in their own circumstances and their hopes. And they were transnational feminists who have, I think, contribute to a more expansive view of gender equality on a global stage. Looking the past to inform our present, what the late Peggy Pasco referred to as the conversational nature of history, is a time-honored feminist tradition. Despite belonging to the largest ethno-racial group in the United States, with a history dating back to the 1500s, Latina narratives barely appear in the historiographical register. Over the past 30 years, I have felt privileged to belong to an ever-growing number of scholars involved in this reclamation and reinterpretation of the past. Pushing beyond the nation-state, trans-hemispheric perspectives offer a fuller recounting of Latina feminist traditions. In the words of Rosa Rodriguez-Lopez, aka Luisa Moreno, if we kept searching, we could find an extensive list of audacious and determined feminists. We could see them planting seeds on stones, the same seeds that today have flourished and tomorrow give the world the sweetness of its perfect fruit. Gracias.
Okay, we have 2 microphones lined up on either side of the room for questions.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for coming tonight. I have a question about a phrase you used, conjugating identity. Can you talk about what that means and what it looks like in this particular context, and how it relates to intersectional feminism?
It's a longer talk, and I was trying to do this. Conjugating identity is my idea. It's the idea that people invent, claim, invent, and reinvent themselves. And they do it based on a purposeful, self-reflexive identity. They are selecting, like Moreno selected the fact that she was not going to be the elite woman, that she was going to become this radical labor organizer. And so she changed her name to reflect that consciousness. So it's sort of a purposeful, I would say, invention or claiming of an identity for a purpose. It was purposeful, and she did it to facilitate her life work as a labor organizer and a Sure.
Do you think that was necessary for her efficacy as a labor organizer, or is that part of her effort?
I think that, first of all, I don't think she ever could totally escape that image of the lady. And certainly, but I think she was for her, she was someone who really did not, she always knew she was one of all, and she didn't try to pretend she was something she wasn't. But for her, it was a deliberate act. For her, it was a deliberate act to sing this for someone, to become this family. Part of it, I think, is alienation from the family, but part of it, I think, is just this like baptism of dedicating herself. I mean, she is someone who always believed that there would be some sort of proletarian revolution. She was a committed Marxist until her death. And also whatever the cost. And she was very, until the Cold War, until her arrest, she was fairly refugee Marxist. In fact, in terms of her, when she filed for her second papers of citizenship, she put that she would never see. Later on, given what happened to her, because later on she was involved with the Japanese government and what in the 1950s, because she had to flee from the CIA-sponsored coup, she became like a lot of people who were had their lives uprooted by the Cold War, the expats. And so she would say things like, when I interviewed her for death, she said, in fact, she's probably not very happy with me right now. She died in 1992, because she would say, you know, if you say I'm a member of the Communist Party, I'll never speak to you again. You know, you can say I'm a Marxist. She can't say I'm a member of the CP. But then I get her FBI file, you know, her immigration file, and you know, she's saying it in her own writing that she had been a member.
Thank you for coming out. That was just a wonderful, wonderful talk.
Thank you.
And your last comment actually anticipated the question I was going to ask.
Okay.
I'm curious if you would tell us a little bit. This is a geeky,
Yeah.
historiographic
Yeah.
question. What was the archive? What did you use to put together these stories? Where is this all coming together from, please? And
Oh,
thank you.
gosh, it's from everything. Okay. I've been working on this like 30 years. 30 years. What happened? Well, in 1978, between my first and second year of graduate school, my advisor, Al Camarillo, had interviewed Luisa Moreno 2 years before, consecutively. And he was unable to go down, because his wife was expecting their first child, to go down to have her look at the transcripts and make connections. So he sent me. So I got to spend the summer, a good part of the summer in Guadalajara, following her around and being, again, geeking out. I have a lot of sort of stories that I hope to make in the book about, you know, the way in which I continually seem to embarrass myself. She, you know, and so I remember the last day of my stay, I said, I know what I'm going to do for my dissertation. I'm going to write about you. And she says, no, you're not. He says, you're going to write about the cannery workers. And that's how my life began, is that, and through her help, and also by serendipity, the assistant dean of graduate studies was an ABD in history from UC Riverside, a man by the name of Ed Escobar, who's now an associate professor of history at Arizona State, and a dear friend, and he asked me what I did during summer. When we were introduced, I said, oh, you know, I met Luisa Moreno, but I got to find out who would join these cannery workers in this union, and I'm going on, and she goes, Ukapawa, goes, I think my mother was involved in that union. His mother was like the leader of the California sanitary canning strike. You know, so all sort of that fit together. I've been, of course, to DC Department of Labor. I have, you know, Ukapawa files, there's no one place. They were all sort of to the wind, so to speak. There's some stuff at Giannini at Berkeley. There's some stuff at the Department of Labor. There's some stuff at the AFL-CIO archives, but not very much. And there were a lot in people's garages, people I interviewed, particularly organizers gave me a lot of stuff. I was basically snowballs. Was basically handed from one organizer to another. I was able to locate additional cannery workers beyond Carmen, and was able to, and that's how the first book, but writing about Moreno became one of those efforts. One of the first time I ever talked about her is I gave a talk at NYU, I think 1996, and one of her friends who had known her as an organizer in Florida and had known her as part of an expat community in Mexico City in the 50s, basically said, I'm going to hear you talk about my friend Rosa. And if I like what you have to say, I'll let you interview me on your visit. Okay, so I thought, okay, no pressure there. So I spot her right away. She comes in this plain cloth coat, this elderly woman, really, you know, chiquita, really. And she comes, she sits there in the front row. And so I'm sitting there and I'm giving the talk. And afterwards she says, thank you for bringing her to life to me. She says, she goes, here's my address. I'll see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. So I get there. And not only do I interview her, but she brings other friends from this radical expat community who actually, Alvazats actually knew her family in Guatemala. And so I was able to get additional that way. So it's a lot of sort of serendipity. And also getting, you know, the materials on Gabriela Mistral is the result of incredible generosity. Patricia Arms is a historian who teaches at a small university in Canada. I knew as a graduate student at Arizona State. And she's working on Guatemalan feminism like in 44 and beyond. But she's the one who told me, like, oh, Gabriel Mistral, that's, this is, so we talked a bit when we overlapped at ASU, although she was never my student. She went to the Biblioteca Nacional, and she found the writings. There are no Xerox machines. There's no finding aids, but she stumbled on them, and she took pictures. And she burned a CD for me. There are not many people who would do that. I mean, incredible act of generosity. Since then, I have found scholars in Spain who have written about La Sociedad Gabriela Mistral, so I'm using a little bit of that work, although I disagree a bit with some of their interpretation. I'll talk about that a little bit in the biography. And also being able to continue to interview people. I was one of I interviewed Alice McGrath before she died to talk about Moreno's work and her third husband's work with the Sleepy Lagoon Defense Committee. The last thing that I received was the FBI file. That was the hardest thing, actually, to get. The immigration INS file wasn't that hard, but that was the hardest. I knew her daughter. I interviewed her daughter. I have photos. I have a lot of things her daughter gave me that I'm going to be able to use in the book. There's also the Southern California Library for Social Studies Research in Los Angeles. It's on Vermont Avenue. It's amazing. It's a community library, and it is the library of the Los Angeles left. It is a library where it's in Watts, and during the LA uprising, people from the neighborhood came out and protected the library, saying this is the people's library. So it's also one of those things where you always want to support this library because it's not. You go in there, people are happy to see you. People aren't looking to see if you're taking something. You're not going to confession, like if you're going to the Bancroft in California. But the type of security, it is a, if you've done research at the Bancroft, and I think that's, it's a real treasure. So I've just sort of, met people, talked to them, have gathered documents. And now it's time to write it. I mean, there's no avoiding it now. In fact, and in fact, I'm going to be on leave next spring this spring to try to crank some chapters out.
Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I have a question about genre. So it sounds like you're writing a biography.
It's a creative nonfiction. It's going to be more creative. It's going to be freedom of the footnote. I'm going to have a big bibliographic essay.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to hear your reflections on genre, sort of what are the things that become open, the new possibilities, but also potentially the constraints of how you're thinking about writing this.
I can't write everything. I mean, I think part of it is that, it's going to be the biography, I would like people to read it I'd like to reach more of a popular audience, so I like it to be more like creative nonfiction, rather than having to cite every little thing. I would really like to have some freedom of the footnote in terms of having, like if I quote from a source, quote that, but have much more of a sort of a flexible, particularly with some of the personal material and things that I have. But I want people to read the story. I want people to engage in it. It will be a way in which, what will be tough for me is because I love to sort of engage with other scholars in my work, and I'm going to have to not do that. I'm going to just have to do that in the footnote. I'm not going to be able to do that in the text. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
I was really interested in the 1920s and kind of going into the 30s and kind of the cosmopolitan nature of Mexico and
Yes.
New York. I was wondering if you got into Adriana Williams and her biography of Miguel Covarrubias.
No, I haven't.
There's like this bar in Mexico City that like Dr. Adel and Diego Rivera and Frida used to hang out at, but then they had a friend that owned a bookstore in New York.
That's one reason why they might have gone to New York.
In Fifth Avenue, I guess. But from there, Covarrubias went to New York and then met with Julio Antonio Mella and that
Can
crew.
we talk at the reception? I'd love the citation.
Okay.
Because I'm just getting into
So
that second
it's because
part.
you were talking about the archive, so I wonder if you... There's
No.
like this climate of like anarchism in these bars in Mexico and
Yeah, and it's
and
one of
even-
those things where she said she wasn't political, and I don't believe that. She goes,
Okay.
"Oh, I wasn't political in Mexico. I haven't." Given who she consorted with, I don't believe that's true. I think her politicization actually probably occurred in Mexico. Yes.
So you talk about how she's really never able to shake off her class background, you know, how the people knew her as this like classy labor organizer. So I was wondering, was there ever any tension from the workers and being like, you know, you don't understand who we are, or like you don't come from our
Oh,
background?
yeah. Oh, yeah, and okay, Emma Teniuca, we know from Chicano history, the fiery labor organizer, she and Luisa Moreno kind of hated each other. Never got along. Emma Teniuca very reluctantly stepped aside when the president of Ukapawa, Donald Henderson, told her to step aside and let Moreno take over. In fact, some people historians who've been very loyal to Emma Teniuca have sort of written Luisa Moreno out of the story. And in fact, on an interview of Emma, and later in life, she referred to her as the damn Spaniard. And this was like a lifelong enmity, because believe me, in the interviews, Luisa Moreno doesn't have a much kind word to say about Emma Teniuca either. So it is, but these are women who should have been allies. They should have been friends. And, you know, and I think part of it is because of the tension.
So before we thank Dr. Ruiz for this wonderful talk, we made it through technical glitches. We
I'm
made it
sorry.
through uncooperative microphones, but it was the richness and the texture of the talk and just the enthusiasm and excitement of such a wonderful a plethora of amazing sources, the kinds of sources I wish I had as a medievalist. I'm jealous. That carried us through this wonderful, wonderful exchange. I want to remind folks that Dr. Ruiz will be giving a research seminar tomorrow at 10 a.m. in the Hillel meeting room, and if you have not RSVP'd and would like to attend, please send an email to csrea@brown.edu. And again, we have a reception waiting for everyone outside, and before we enjoy that, let us thank our distinguished guest. Thank you so much.
Thank you, been wonderful. Very patient.